welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. Thanks for joining us on another question and answer episode of the Old Front Line podcast. We're still currently going through the questions that came in this summer, even though we're now approaching the autumn, and it just goes to show just how many questions you're sending in, and some really, really excellent questions that have come through in the last couple of months. There's two main ways you can submit your question. One is via email, and the other is via the Discord server where you log on and you can leave a question there. So keep them coming. And this week we're going to go straight in with our first question. And that question comes from John Henderson on the Discord server. John writes, I've always wondered what happened in the days after the armistice. Did soldiers stay in the trenches for long before they were moved out? Was there any worry that the Germans would betray the deal and attack? In the medium term, how much of the trench infrastructure was moved out with the men when they left? Were soldiers free to wander over no man's land and into German positions, as I'm sure they would have been fascinated to explore those areas? Did any men sleep in the trenches on the night of the 11th of November and immediately afterwards? What was the plan to immediately decommission the battlefield, and were the Germans allowed or even required to assist in this process? So there's quite a few different questions there, John, but at the kind of central core of this is what happened on the 11th of November 1918, the last day of the Great War on the Western Front. And I remember many years ago watching a documentary about this, which had some dramatic reconstruction in it, where they showed soldiers in trenches on the morning of the 11th of November in those final minutes, ticking towards 11 o'clock, looking through their trench periscopes out into no man's land, and the bombardment's going on, the machine guns are firing, and then it's 11 o'clock and all is silent, and they go out onto that battlefield and the Germans are gone. Now that's a kind of probably a popular perception of what happened on the 11th of November, but it is a million miles from the truth, because if you look at where the British and Commonwealth front was by that last day of the First World War, it was now far removed from the battlefield of the previous 4 years. The German front had collapsed, and with it, that trench line that had dominated the Western Front for those 4 years had collapsed too. And for the British, the last time that they'd fought against a significant German trench system on the Western Front in France, for example, was on the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line in the first week of October 1918, so a month before the armistice. And what happened in that period that followed? Trench warfare was gone. They were advancing over open fields, through woods and copses, into little villages, and there was street fighting that was much more, when you read about it, much more like the street fighting that we'd associate with the Second World War in many of these places. And the Germans use a lot of natural features as part of their defence. So they used rivers and they used canals. The Selle River, for example, not far from Le Cateau. And then the other side of Le Cateau was the Sambre Canal, where the last great battle of the First World War involving British troops took place on the 4th of November 1918, when, amongst many others, Wilfred Owen was killed with the 2nd Manchesters crossing the Sambre Canal at Ours. So those final days of the war were very different to the war that had preceded that last ember of the fight on the Western Front. The trenches were gone. No man's land was gone. Barbed wire was gone. The Germans were defending positions that they were very quickly vacating after a fight. And while there were some impromptu trenches here and there was no connected trench line. And the very last fight, which was in the city of Mons on the morning of the 11th of November 1918, was a bit of urban warfare, where Canadian troops came into the city. There was a fight involving the Black Watch of Canada and Will Bird, a writer who was awarded the military medal for that final battle at Mons. I've often spoken about him on this podcast. He was there, and he wrote about that in Ghosts Have Warm Hands. And then on the other side of Mons, coming up towards the Mons-Condé Canal, was men of the 28th Battalion Canadian Infantry, and they crossed over into a street in that area just beyond the canal, where George Lawrence Price, a soldier in that battalion, became the last British and Commonwealth casualty, not in a trench, not in no man's land, literally standing in the street when a German sniper shot him through the chest, and he died 2 minutes before the armistice came into effect. So you can see that, kind of looking at the questions that you've posed here about men being in the trenches when the armistice came in, when the war ended on the Western Front, there were no trenches. It was open warfare. So there were no trenches to sleep in that night, no man's land to explore, and the Germans pulled back on most parts of the front pretty quickly, and the British pursued them after the armistice to a stop line, but the Germans were kind of given free rein, really, to pull right back to Germany, which is kind of what happened. And you mentioned in your question about, were there worries that the Germans might not observe the terms of the armistice? Would they attack again? And if we jump to the American front, where there was a similar kind of picture, the men of the American Expeditionary Force had fought their way in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, fought through that Argonne forest, and had got to the Meuse River. And much of their battles on that last day of the war, again, did not involve trenches. They were going into towns like Stenay. They were crossing rivers. And when we made The Last Day of World War I, which is a program that we made with Michael Palin in 2008, we looked at the US Marine Corps, who crossed the Meuse River that day on footbridges. They were coming down the slopes of the river valley, going across the footbridges, being hit by machine gun fire, and men were dropping into the river, and then they were fighting in open ground on the other side. So kind of similar situation to them. But Pershing, General Pershing, who commanded the American Expeditionary Force, had launched these attacks right along the American front, and in many respects had been much later criticised for this because it was the last day of the war. But he was one who did not trust the Germans. He thought that the Germans might eventually break the terms of the armistice, and that it was better at that moment, when he was in control of the battle space, to actually take his men onto that ground and fight and get to positions that they wanted to occupy. So that was his reason behind fighting on what became the last day of the war, but at the time many were convinced that it wouldn't be, that somehow the fighting would break out again. So in terms of going back to that old battlefield where the lines had been static for so long, that didn't happen until after the Germans had pulled back into Germany. The terms of the armistice came fully into operation, and the war was completely over. British troops didn't just pack up themselves and go home. They went into Belgium. They stayed in places like Namur and Charleroi and Tournai, Dinant, so many other places besides. Eventually, groups of soldiers would then cross into Germany itself and become the nucleus of the British Army of the Rhine at Cologne. But during that period, during the winter of 1918-19, some units, some men did go back to those old battlefields and carry out probably some of the very first battlefield tours of the places where they and their units had served. And we've got some evidence of this, and I've seen photographic evidence of it in photo albums that I've got and seen over the years, where men were going back before they were discharged to see the places where they had fought. And in terms of decommissioning, as you call it, that battlefield when the war was over, and were the Germans allowed or even required to assist with this process, well, there were large numbers of German prisoners of war. And when the clear-up began in that period after the armistice on into early 1919, when to begin to try and reclaim some of this landscape destroyed by 4 years of war, when trenches were filled in, barbed wire was pushed into shell holes, munitions were cleared off the battlefield, then some of these German prisoners of war were used. Again, I have a photo album belonging to some gunner and ordnance officers who took photographs of the clear-up process, and they had, by the look of these photographs, at their disposal not just their own troops, but they had soldiers from the Chinese Labour Corps to assist them, and also German prisoners of war that were gathering the ordnance together, stockpiling it, and then blowing it up to dispose of it. So there was a beginning of a decommission that went on into the spring and the summer, and at the same time as that decommission's taking place, the battlefields are cleared from the dead. And all of that really is a kind of a podcast in its own right, and we've touched on different aspects of it, but maybe that immediate aftermath is something that we should return to sometime soon. But I guess, again, returning to the central premise of your question, the end of the war was very different to the war that had taken place over the preceding 4 years. The trenches were gone, no man's land, that kind of shell crater battlefield. They were in open ground or in urban areas, and the war kind of fizzled out, I think, when you look at the experience of many troops, signalling the beginning of the end of demobilisation and the total end to the war for those men, and indeed women who were then serving close to the battlefield by that stage as well. So a great question, John, and a fascinating subject, and aspects of all of that, I'm sure, we will return to. So moving on to question 2, which is also from the Discord server, this time from Stuart Jackson. He says, I was just reading the WFA, the Western Front Association bulletin, and wondered why Captain Albert Ball was buried in the German extension to Anna Lewin Communal Cemetery, and he does not have a Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone. Is it due to the fact as to where he was shot down, but don't know why he has a non-standard headstone? Well, Albert Ball was one of the top fighter aces of the Great War. He flew with the Royal Flying Corps and was awarded the Victoria Cross and indeed numerous other medals for gallantry for his ability as a pilot in combat over the Western Front in those first few years of the Great War. In fact, he became probably one of the most famous pilots during the war itself. And he was shot down on the 7th of May 1917 behind the German lines, roughly northeast of the city of Lens. This was an area, the village of Anna Lewin, which you mentioned, was a kind of marshalling area for German troops. There was railhead close by, billeting, places for the soldiers to sleep in when they were going to and from the trenches in that sector around Loos, Hill 70 and Lens itself. But air combat, of course, was not restricted by what was happening on the ground. It would often take place behind enemy lines, and during that air combat, Albert Ball was shot down and his aircraft crashed close to where the Germans had their camps in this area. So when an Allied aircraft came down, obviously they would go forward, see if the pilot was still alive. In this case, he wasn't, he was dead, and he would have had identification on him to indicate who he was. It's quite likely the Germans realised the significance of this loss and the significance of Albert Ball and who he was, because I would guess that he was probably just as famous on the German side as he was on the British, and they brought him in for burial, respecting the death of an Allied soldier, just as British and Commonwealth and French soldiers respected the death of German soldiers. He was brought in for burial in one of their own burial grounds, one of their own graveyards, which was the German cemetery at Anna Lewin at this time, which is still there to this day, with German graves and German unit memorials in it, and it's very much typical of many behind the German line cemeteries in that area. But as you say, he is still buried there. That's kind of factor one here. And secondly, he does not have a white Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone. Now, he came from Nottingham, and his father was Mayor of Nottingham, a well-connected individual who was devastated by the loss of his son. And like many fathers, like many parents in the Great War, they wanted to memorialise them in some way. Some were able to do that in a small way on the mantelpiece of their house with the medals and the memorial plaque. or whatever it was, just even a photograph hanging on a wall. And above me here is the photograph of William Baldwin of the Royal Sussex Regiment, who was killed on the 1st of August 1917. He sits on the wall of where I record these podcasts, looking down on me, just as once he would have looked down, no doubt, on his parents, who fondly remembered him and had that picture on his wall. That was kind of one level of commemoration, and if you were well connected and with money, as Albert Ball's father was, then you could do it in a different way. And he wanted, as many parents did, to build a proper memorial over his son's grave in France. Now, if he was in a British cemetery, had been buried in a British cemetery, that would not be an option. But he wasn't. He was buried in a German cemetery. And there would have been a move to concentrate that burial of Albert Ball into a British cemetery. It's quite likely that he would have ended up in Cabaret Rouge near Souchez, which is a very large cemetery in that area of northern France and contains a huge number of burials of men that were moved into there from German military cemeteries, where these men had died in air combat behind enemy lines or who had died as prisoners of war in German field hospitals. So that's probably where he would have ended up. But it appears that Albert Ball's father resisted the moving of his son's grave from Anna-Lewin to a British cemetery so that he could build this memorial, because I would guess that the rules of commemoration, if that grave was in the German cemetery, probably could be bent. There would be a bit of a grey area there, field grey in this case, if you excuse the pun. So he was able to build exactly what he wanted, which was a big memorial cross with the details of his son on it, the emblem of the Royal Flying Corps, and built in the stone and design of his choosing, rather than have to accept a standard War Graves Commission headstone. And that German cemetery was amongst those that were kept in the 1950s. Following the Second World War, the German Volksbund, the German War Graves Commission, decided to close a large number of cemeteries and move them into others, bury the men in mass graves such as Langemarck up in Flanders and Neuville-Saint-Vaast down in northern France near Arras, for example. And again, these lads could have ended up there, but this cemetery was kept, and so Albert Ball's grave was not moved. Now, if it had been moved in the 50s, then this memorial might have been dismantled and he might have been moved to an open cemetery at that time and be buried today under a War Graves Commission headstone. But none of those things happened, so that German cemetery remains, the German burials remain within it with the memorials, and that original memorial that was placed after the war on his grave by the Albert Ball family remains there as well. It's not entirely unique, because there are some non-standard headstones like this, even in some Commonwealth cemeteries, but certainly the circumstances of this one are very much unique. And there is a secondary memorial to him here. When you look out the back of the cemetery, across the fields beyond, into that kind of flat landscape of northern France, there's a wooded area where once there were two marker stones signalling the front and the rear of Albert Ball's aircraft. His crash site, basically. Only one of those survives today, but that's there too. It's a fascinating story, this, Stuart. Thanks for asking this question. And the air war side of things is something that I've long neglected for this podcast, but which I'm going to put right sometime this autumn/winter. So if you've never had a chance to go to Anna-Lewin, to that German cemetery there, it's fascinating in its own right with the individual memorials that are there to German units and so on, but it's also obviously fascinating for that connection to Albert Ball. And some years ago, the local school renamed the school in honour of Albert Ball VC. So if we move on to our third question, this comes from M. Lambert on email. He says, a little bit obscure, but not off the old front line, what happened to the Menin Gate buglers during the German occupation of Belgium in Ypres during World War II? And also, are there any accounts of the gardeners of the Imperial War Graves Commission during the Second World War? Well, the gardeners, I would refer you back to a previous podcast that we did, And that was a trench chat with Caitlin De Angelis, who has written this fantastic book called The Caretakers, which looks at the War Graves Commission Gardeners and the secret battle to rescue Allied airmen in World War II. I'll put a link to that podcast in the show notes for this Q&A episode so you can go back to it. Now, that's one angle of what these gardeners who stayed behind did. There was a large number of them that were British-born or that were sons of British soldiers who had become gardeners themselves, and they were the kind of next generation to do it. Quite a few of them, up in Flanders, for example, had attended the Ypres School, the one at the back of St George's Memorial Church, which had been sponsored by the public school Eton. And this school had been set up for the British community in Ypres in that interwar period. And some of the children who had attended that school went on to fight Hitler in the Second World War. And there's an excellent documentary, which I'm pretty sure is still out there. I'll see if I can find a link to it for you. Again, put that in the show notes, called The Children Who Fought Hitler, which describes those who did get back to Britain, fought in the army, but others who ended up in the resistance as well. So there's quite a few incredible stories of these war graves gardeners who were involved in resistance activities, whether it be Belgium or whether it be France. And I'm hoping that Caitlin will go on to kind of write a lot more about this, because I think she's only kind of touched the surface of this subject in that fantastic book that she published last year. So have a check out of that podcast episode to discover a bit more about that. But your other question, which is about the buglers who sounded the last post underneath the Menin Gate, what happened to them during the Second World War? Well, that process had started in the summer of 1928, about a year after the gate had been unveiled, and the local population of Ypres, the people of Ypres, decided to play the last post as a mark of respect for the sacrifice of 250,000 British and Empire troops, as they would have called them then, who had died in defence of Ypres during those 4 years of the Great War. And they used the men of the local fire brigade to do that, who were already trained to play the bugle, and they were the ones who began it in that summer of 1928. That continued up until 1940, and it didn't continue right up to the moment that the fighting began with the invasion of Belgium on the 10th of May 1940. It actually stopped before that, because it had been decided that in case of air raids, bugles would be used to sound an alarm to the local civilian population. So in that kind of very nervous lead up to when the German attack did come, the sounding of bugles at the Menin Gate was causing some alarm, I believe, and a decision was made to stop it then. The fighting took place right across Belgium, all around Ypres. Some of the cemeteries were damaged. There was fighting in some of the areas where they'd been fighting in the Great War. When you go across that landscape today, there's quite a few places where you discover that the First World War meets the Second, where there's graves of British soldiers and memorials and damage to monuments from the 1920s. But with total German victory by June 1940 and the whole of Western Europe now occupied, the people of Ypres were now under German occupation. And I believe that a group of them did go to the German commander in Ypres and request that they continue to play the last post. And a question, it is said, was asked, was this a memorial service for all of the dead from the Great War, or was it just for British and Empire soldiers? And that committee said, well, actually, it's just for them. So the German commander forbid the playing of the last post. That is the kind of accepted story of this. And I guess that's not a conversation that was ever properly written down, and it's been passed down verbally over the decades, and one that I've heard many, many times over the years, going right back to the 1980s when I used to go to the British Legion meetings in Ypres and hear these kind of stories being told. But whatever conversation was had, the last post was definitely not played in Ypres. It was played in Brookwood in Surrey, which is a cemetery from the First World War, which also now contains graves from the Second and various other memorials, and men from many nationalities. There's an American plot in there as well, for example, from the First World War. But during the Second World War, a group of people played the last post in absentia, if you like, from being able to do it in Ypres. So during the 4 years of occupation in Belgium, in Ypres itself, the bugles were hidden, deliberately hidden. And on the very day that Ypres was liberated by General Maczek's Polish armoured forces, who came into the city after a stiff fight, they got in, liberated Ypres on the 6th of September 1944, and that night the bugles came out of hiding and were played once more in the presence of Polish troops who paraded, of some British troops who were fighting alongside them, and some of the civilian population. It was played that night, the evening of the 6th of September 1944, and has been played every single evening ever since. This incredible kind of continuum of remembrance. So hopefully, Mr. Lambert, that answers your question. And if you go back through the podcast catalogue, you won't just find that interview with Caitlin, you'll also find one of the episodes we did on where World War I meets World War II. So our fourth and final question comes from James on email. He says, my 6-year-old son William joined me to listen to your Lowther's Lambs talk last month, and he wanted me to ask you a question about cannons. So I'll have a go at something I've been pondering on. You often refer to artillery as the king and queen of the battlefield. What was the primary role of artillery on the Western Front, and why did neither side ever seriously gain the upper hand to make a more significant breakthrough? Did the barrages on the Somme demonstrate that it wasn't a game-changer like tanks turned out to be? Once the big breakthroughs on both sides happened in 1918, did the role of artillery lessen once both sides were on the run? Did the original type of trench warfare which emerged simply not allow it to? I know that you mention your old friend Malcolm Vivian quite a lot and wonder whether he gave you a clearer sense of how artillery would or could have obtained the upper hand, or how the role of artillery changed as the war moved on. Now, the War of the Guns is a podcast that is coming down the line to look at this kind of thing, because I've had quite a few questions like this, James, and your son William was very, very clever in kind of coming up with this question about cannons, as he called it, because artillery were the king and queen of the battlefield. Probably not at the very beginning, although artillery demonstrated in some of those early battles what it could do, with the firing of shrapnel over close columns of French soldiers in the battles of the frontiers, when the French lost huge numbers of men in the open fields of the southern Belgian Ardennes, or in that area in France close to the border with Belgium. Those catastrophic casualties of August 1914 that the French suffered, and artillery played a heavy role in that. It wasn't just rifles from German soldiers and machine guns, it was artillery causing so many of those losses. And for the British, they largely went to war believing that artillery probably hadn't changed much since the 19th century, and that it would be used perhaps to fire indirectly over long distances on specific targets, but on the battlefield would be sighted close to infantry units to give it protection, probably firing over open sights. But the static war, changed all that. Artillery could not be brought up into frontline trenches and fire. They did attempt to bring up small caliber guns. There are some examples in the Indian Corps, for example, of them bringing up mounting guns and putting them on fixed positions in the forward trenches and firing at close range at German positions in northern France. But it was realised that in a static war, artillery would take on a completely new dimension, because it could be placed away from the battlefield area, fire over your own friendly trenches onto the enemy static trenches beyond, and assist you in keeping them on their toes, suppressing them, demoralising them with bombardments, and also, if you attacked those static positions, that artillery could be used to assist you to do that. And in 1915, you see examples of this where they try to combine infantry assaults with the use of artillery. Often it fails. Often it doesn't really achieve the effects that is desired to assist those men to take those bits of ground and those forward German defences. And if there is any kind of learning curve on the Western Front during the First World War, this is a phrase that came out via people like Gary Sheffield in the 1990s, for example, which many people would disagree that there was any kind of learning curve on the kind of path that has been discussed previously. And even Gary Sheffield himself thinks that's probably not a useful term now. But if there was any kind of learning curve, you definitely see it with the artillery, because as the war moves on, artillery moves on with it and becomes more and more proficient. Creeping barrages, using artillery in much greater density. So concentrating your heavy guns to more clearly target enemy strongholds, not relying on field guns to destroy positions. You use those to cut wire, to take out infantry and protect advancing friendly infantry with a creeping barrage as they move across the battlefield. The heavier guns, 4.5s, 6-inch and above, those bigger ones manned by the Royal Garrison Artillery, they are used to target specific defences. Malcolm Vivian, who you mentioned, he was an RGA forward observation officer who on the first day of the Somme was knocking out German positions to the south of Gommecourt village with his guns, and went on to become a bunker buster at Arras in April and May 1917, and was later awarded the Military Cross for firing on the German positions around Lens, assisting the Canadians in the battles there in 1917, for example. So you see a development and change of use of artillery, a more specialist use, and by the time of the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, the British have the ability to map fire. So you can give an artillery unit a series of map coordinates and they can drop shells directly onto it rather than have to register that artillery and obviously give the enemy a bit of an indication that you're interested in their bit of ground by registering your fire onto it. So being able to map fire was only possible in the last year of the war. And as you move into 1918, rather than as your suggestion puts across that the Allies, because of the movement of the front and the toing and froing with German offensives in the spring and then the Allied offensives in the summer and autumn of 1918, did the kind of war leave artillery behind. In fact, what you see is a greater use of artillery, particularly tactical artillery on the battlefield itself to assist in those advances, and a greater coordination between infantry, guns, tanks and aircraft in the sky. And in that final period of 1918, aircraft can fly with fairly small-scale radio sets that can transmit and receive Morse, and they can spot for the guns from the air. So the kind of technological advances that push forward in the Great War and the implementation of artillery keeps it on that throne of being the king and queen of the battlefield, really from beginning to end. And it's such an important part of it. And we haven't even mentioned trench mortars and that kind of equipment that was there to assist men on the battlefields. That is a kind of artillery, mortars that can close support infantry in an attack or in a static position, and the enemy, of course, doing the same with their trench mortars, Minenwerfers. So it's a complex subject, one that definitely deserves its own podcast, and I hope, James, that you and William will find that subsequent podcast about the War of the Guns kind of an add-on, bit more in-depth detail to your excellent question here. So, thank you all for your questions for this question and answer episodes of the Old Front Line podcast. Keep them coming, as we've said. Send them in via the Discord server or via email. And I really enjoy doing these questions. I did have one question that came in. This is kind of a supplementary one for this episode. And that question asked me, how do you answer these questions? Well, basically, I cut and paste what you've asked into a Word document. I have that up on the screen in front of me. I read out your question and then I answer it. And that is something that I've kind of been doing for quite a few decades now with battlefield tours, because when you're on a battlefield tour, you're standing there on that landscape of the First World War, and someone who is listening to what you're saying is thinking about a particular element of it, and they can pitch in with a question. Sometimes those questions can be a bit random and kind of curveball, and you're very much on the spot. And I've always enjoyed that someone can ask a question, you can kind of think about it, react to it, and go back to them with hopefully an interesting answer that not just gives them some additional information, but makes them think and perhaps go away and do a bit more reading on the subject. And that's what I hope with all of these questions that we've answered over the last 14 episodes. And this is the 14th episode with this one of these Q&As. I hope that it's made you think about different aspects of the First World War and perhaps go off and learn a little bit more and be inspired to go off and learn a little bit more about them. So, more questions and answers on the Old Front Line soon. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.